Yes, welcome everybody to the third episode of the Africa Football Business Show. I'm Shon Osimbo. I'm so excited to be here today. And today we'll be talking to an amazing guest. Don't forget, the Africa Football Business Show is brought to you by the Football Foundation for Africa. This is the place where we are creating conversations that will help shape the football industry in Africa. All we want to do here is improve the football on our continent, and we are actually looking for African solutions to African problems. It's about time we started having this conversation, and that's why we started this show, to actually talk to everyone across the world on which steps Africa needs to take in order to achieve those heights when it comes to the amazing game. Today we have a very amazing guest here with us. His name is Peter Alegi, also a football historian. Welcome to the show, Peter. So quickly, Peter is a professor of history at the Michigan State University and also the author of Africa Soccer Scapes. That is how a continent changed the world's game. And also Nadumani Soccer, Politics and Society in South Africa. You know, he knows so much when it comes to football on the continent. He has traversed the continent. He has written about it. He has interacted with so many people and so many football stakeholders. And today, we actually get to listen to him tell us which way to go when it comes to African football, because it's time African football made its mark. That's like a permanent mark, and a strong saying to show that we are here and it's time to actually take over because of the talent that is actually on this continent. Welcome to the show, Peter. How are you this evening?
Thank you, Shon. Doing great. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So quickly, before we dive in, just tell people who is Peter Alegi and where your love for the game came from.
Well, I was born with the football virus in Rome, Italy, and grew up there, hence my 2006 World Cup winning shirt. So, as I said, it was in the air we breathed, and I played and watched the game too much, probably showed signs of obsessive love for football quite early on. And, Rome is an old city. It's 2,700 plus years old. So football goes hand in hand with history in the eternal city, as we call it. And so not only was I quite fond of the game itself, but also the place of sports and games in history, because it was the ancient Romans, right, who created the first mega stadiums alongside the ancient Greeks, right, and developed this idea that there should be sports festivals to entertain the masses, to perhaps distract them from rebellion or even revolution. And so for me, sports was always entangled with culture and with politics and with history. And when I was a teenager, I moved to the United States, and it was very different. In the United States, football or soccer was really a secondary sport, and it was quite shocking, frankly. But at the same time, through soccer, I was able to open doors and meet people and connect and integrate into a culture that today really loves soccer and is growing rapidly.
Yes, and I can't wait for you to share your wisdom as we continue with the show. So you have done, of course, a lot of research when it comes to football on the continent, that is Africa. What interests you, or let's say fascinates you about the game here, and how is it different from, you say, where you came to love the game in Italy, and also when you shifted all the way to the United States? What's different?
Well, I mean, what was different for me was my interest in South Africa and in the anti-apartheid struggle, and realizing that sports in South Africa in the liberation movement played a very significant role. So, the Olympic boycott of South Africa and the fact that FIFA was the first major international body to suspend and later expel South Africa really provided a boost to the fight against apartheid. And I was interested in that. And that was one of the reasons why I went to South Africa to work as a physical education instructor and soccer coach in 1993, so before the first democratic elections. And what I realized was that, soccer was a real pillar of Black culture, in particular in South Africa, in a way that almost resembled and in some ways maybe even exceeded what I had seen at home in Italy, and was certainly far superior in commitment and love than in the United States at the time. So that's
Mhm.
really what my initial attraction was, and it just grew and developed from there.
Yes, and also you have written a lot about football. That
Hmm.
is especially when I was reading your work the other day when it comes to also the southern part of the continent, and you note the ups and the downs of this game when it comes to the African continent. Can you help our viewers just understand how the process has been, and also the different eras? Colonial, post-colonial. I know you've touched there when I asked you the question earlier, but just if you can delve further into it.
Sure. I mean, one of the things that many people don't realize is how old the history of the game in Africa is. It goes back to
Hmm.
the 1860s. So, the first documented matches that we have found so far took place in South Africa, which shouldn't be surprising given the history of settler colonialism there, in 1862, in places like
Hmm.
Port Elizabeth and Cape Town.
Hmm.
I'm going to show you an image soon, not right now, but soon, that may be the oldest image of a soccer team on the African continent. So, 150 plus years of history, I think, is really important to understand the passion that African people have for the game. It's as old as the game itself. The rules of soccer or football were only codified, right, starting in December of 1863. So that's very important. And I would also
Hmm.
add that there was a long tradition, of course, of pre-colonial sports and games.
Hmm.
If you've been to West Africa, you know how big wrestling is in countries like Senegal, or Niger or
Hmm.
Nigeria. Of course, running in Kenya, Kenyatta describes in his master's thesis that became Facing Mount Kenya the importance of running in initiations, for example. In southern Africa, you have stick fighting still today in the rural areas, a very, very big sport. So, there was a lot of indigenous athletic competition taking place before the arrival of white colonizers. But the modern sports came, of course, with Western settlers and colonizers, mainly missionaries, but also traders and civil servants, soldiers, police officers, etc. And in the colonial period, it was remarkable. Maybe this is a good time to shift to the images
Hmm.
that I want to share with the viewers, is how Africans appropriated the game from the British and later from the Portuguese, the French, and the Belgians, and made it their own. So let me try and show you some images because it might help kind of digest what
Yes.
I'm trying to share with the viewers. Okay, so we will go to um, Port Elizabeth, South Africa, and we are
Hmm.
in the year 1869. So 6 years after the rules of football
Wow.
have been agreed to, right? And you see
Hmm.
these kind of semi-distinguished white gentlemen who look like
Hmm.
they could be switching between football and cricket quite easily, given their outfits, right?
The ata, yes.
And you can also imagine that as these matches, which tended to be informal initially, were being played, there was lots of African spectators who were kind of looking on, sometimes being allowed to play, but more often just deciding this might be something fascinating to try. And what
Hmm.
happens, of course, is in South Africa at least, that due to segregation and later to apartheid, white players were not keen on sharing the pitch with Africans and other people of color. And so, as elsewhere in colonial Africa, you have racial segregation in most of the leagues and associations. So,
Hmm.
you do see some mixing taking place in schools. Here's an image from 1907 that shows the role of missionaries, very important, of course, in providing Western style schooling to particularly African boys, but also girls. And this team, the Shooting Stars of Adams College in what is today KwaZulu Natal, became one of the leading teams in the
Hmm.
city of Durban. In fact, a couple of decades later, you see the team has grown to the point where Africa's first Nobel Peace Laureate, Albert Lutuli, which you see indicated there standing with the arrow pointing to him, was the general
Hmm.
secretary of the team. And Lutuli really cut his teeth in politics through football administration. And this is a
Yeah.
pattern that you see elsewhere too, across the continent. So by the time that World War I ends and we go into the interwar period, you see games all over. Here's a match in Dakar in 1919. Here's a team in what was then called Leopoldville in what is now Kinshasa in the DRC around 1930. And around this time is also where African media start really getting excited about the game. And of course, people buying newspapers because in part of sports coverage. And those become great sources for historians like me, for example, and others who want to record this history and preserve it for younger people. And the media is also a place where advertisements and commercialism during the colonial period start to boom. And here's a South African newspaper aimed mainly at mine workers, Umteteli Wabantu, selling football boots.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And radio starts to become the main mass media after World War II in particular. And, the kind of oral tradition that is so integral to African culture really dovetails nicely with the radio medium. And so a lot of the early radio commentators in the 40s and 50s and 60s in particular become kind of like griots, if you will, bards that people associate key moments of their lives and their memories to their voices and to the very, very sophisticated and fascinating ways in which they describe the games. This is Dan Twala from South Africa, but there are many others from across the continent. And, the game was so big that there were already international matches before the end of colonialism. Here's one example of Nigeria, 1959, the year before independence, playing against Dahomey, as Benin was known back then. So what I'm getting at here is that Africans appropriated the game. They made it a central part of their culture in a whole number of ways. And of course, fans are at the center of this. The amount of people who attended, mostly men, but also some women, is really incredible given the limited resources available to most African people during colonialism. And that sets up, right, the arrival of independence for many African countries in the 1960s, where the game just keeps growing. And it plays a key role in some countries, even in the liberation. For example, of Algeria, where a team toured internationally for 3.5 years, sponsored by the National Liberation Front. These were professional players who had been playing in France, and they surreptitiously escaped France and became essentially a national team of a country in waiting. And that's when, for example, the first Algerian national anthem was played, was during one of these matches of the FLN 11. And there are other examples, but I'm not going to get into them now. But maybe another good one is South Africa, which I mentioned before. The fight against apartheid played out in soccer, both at home and at FIFA. So when the colonial period ends and independence comes, one of the big challenges for African nations is how to build a common identity. Because so many, most of the nations in Africa came out of sort of the arbitrary colonial units that had been created in the beginning in the late 19th century. What is a form of culture that brings people together across language lines, across ethnic lines, across religious lines, and so on? Well, football was one of the only available common forms of popular culture. And so you see leaders like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana being very strong supporters of the national team. Black Stars of Ghana, who win the Nations Cup several times during his presidency, but also sponsor competitions like the Nkrumah Cup. Again, you see it everywhere. There's Haile Selassie, 1962, presenting the Africa Cup of Nations to the Ethiopian captain, who interestingly was also part Italian and Eritrean. And Kenneth Kaunda, president of Zambia. There he is with his cabinet team that looks like my over 40 football team. Mobutu of Zaire, Sekou Touré of Guinea, even Idi Amin occasionally showed up at football matches. This is to say, right, that newly independent countries used football to create a national identity and to become first-class citizens in global society.
Yes, and just from your pictures, and some of the pictures have taken me back in terms of, okay, some of them I was not born, but have taken me back, especially when I saw where you have I remember when I was young, I used to listen to football over the radio with my dad, and I remember how the radio commentators was such a big deal, and they're still a big deal now. But back in the day in Africa, they were everything because the TV. Yes, perfect. The TV time wasn't that. Most people didn't have TV sets, so this was. I remember everything. So you've taken me really back, but. Through all this and through the stories, even pre-colonialism and then post, why is it that Africa has not gotten to the standards that you would expect, Peter? What is ailing exactly the African game? Because when you see these pictures and you understand that even till now, politics and also football has gone hand into hand. So you expect some of these established people to put their money back and improve the game. But it's not the case when it comes to so many African countries. What is ailing this beautiful continent when it comes to the game, Peter?
Well, that's a very complicated question to answer. One of the first things I say to my students when they walk into my classroom interested in African history is, trying to challenge their preconceptions about Africa, which is a massive continent. 54 nations, more than 2,100 languages, 1 billion people,
and different cultures.
Yeah. So how do you actually get at that very difficult question? Well, one thing that I can say is, the colonial legacy has something to do with the struggle that African football has had. It's not the only reason for some of the challenges, but it is an important one, because when freedom came, which for most African countries was before, the 1970s, so mostly in the 60s, Africa didn't have a guaranteed spot in the World Cup finals for the men's World Cup. It was only in 1970 that FIFA, after a Ghana-led boycott of the World Cup in 1966, that Africa was awarded a guaranteed berth in the finals. So if you're not allowed to compete at the highest level, it makes it very difficult to grow and develop and achieve success. So it's only in the 1980s, particularly thanks to Cameroon and Algeria, that African football starts to achieve some very important results at the World Cup level. And so, that's a long time. That's a whole generation of footballers that had limited opportunities. Now, there are other issues, of course, right? I mean, one of them is economic, and the economic situation, not just in Africa, but for the global South, is very challenging. Why are so many South American players leaving South America and going to play in Europe and in Asia? Because of the economic situation in South America, which is also quite difficult for many. So Africa is not entirely unique in that kind of relationship with the global North. And then also politically, I think sort of from a governance and leadership standpoint, many African football associations have not served their constituencies well. And that's also complicated things. So it's a mixture of factors. I think there's a historical legacy that hasn't helped, of course. There is an economic inequality between the South and the North that is very, very important, and also between cities and rural areas. And then also, the political administration that has been lacking. And so those are a combination of factors that have made it very difficult for national teams and for clubs to really achieve what I think many of us really feel Africa can achieve.
Yes, and I know you've also traversed the continent when you're talking about the different African nations and how they partake in their different styles of football, and we'll also be getting to that. Any notable achievements of the African game so far till now? And I know you've mentioned some of the things, and also I know having few teams in the World Cup has always been an issue for Africa. And you can feel even CAF at some point they were pushing for more teams to be in the World Cup. So any achievements you've noted so far, and is there hope for this game actually growing and some of these issues being solved?
Well, certainly in terms of notable achievements, you want to look at the pitch, and Cameroon, Senegal, and Ghana all reached the quarterfinals of the World Cup, which I think is, given the history that we just covered, is really a tremendous achievement. And Ghana, came so very close if it weren't for Luis Suarez. and also John's miss in the penalty shootout, right? Ghana would have reached the semifinals. Those are tremendous results. The youth world titles should also be mentioned by Nigeria and Ghana. The Olympic gold medals in the men's by Nigeria and Cameroon.
Nigeria, yes.
Yeah, I mean those are fantastic achievements. And from my perspective, I think South Africa's hosting of the 2010 World Cup in such a successful manner is a notable achievement as well.
Okay, so let's now talk about definitely the history of that's when it comes to the styles of play in African football. What are they? How have they changed over time? Kindly just take us through that.
I think styles of play are really important because as much as we talk about the political significance of football, the economic implications, and so on, really what people come to see is the game itself. And so how the game is played matters, and it matters a lot. So looking at how playing styles developed and changed also tells us a lot about African football cultures and its place in society. And the way the game started in colonial times was very much how it started everywhere around the world, which is in a very basic way, with kick and rush, the kind of working class British, particularly English style of play being dominant, with lots of forwards, only a couple of defenders. And then by the 1930s, you see a shift, thanks in part to the touring teams from Britain and specifically Scotland. A team called Motherwell, for instance, toured twice in Southern Africa and was so popular that black newspapers in South Africa started praising the Motherwell style, which was a short passing game. They noted how the collective movements of Motherwell were remarkably well rehearsed and also effective. And this Motherwell team from Scotland beat the white teams in South Africa, much to the joy of the black fans who were forced to sit in segregated seating areas in the stadiums. And you start to see black teams in South Africa and elsewhere in the continent adopting the Motherwell style, the short passing, the interchanging of positions in the 1930s and into the 1940s. You also see hybrid styles. In other words, a combination of these more collective approaches and more trained approaches, scientific almost approaches of European clubs, professional clubs, with the more sort of playground style that many African players before the 60s grew up with, playing in the streets, where, your technical skill and your improvisation and your guile and your toughness really sort of helped you become a star. And so you had sort of individual skill and trickery combined with more tactical and more, developed approaches. You still don't have full-time coaches, mind you. By the 50s, very few African sides had a full-time coach, but that starts to change in the 50s. And you see, for example, people going to the cinema to watch newsreel of big matches, European Cup matches, and so on. They're starting to read also English and other football magazines and learning new styles. Foreign coaches come to Africa in large numbers, and you see the tactics changing. You start to see the WM system and later the 4-2-4 that Pelé's Brazil team from 1958 popularized. And then by the 80s, with TV and Eastern European coaches in particular from Yugoslavia and elsewhere, you see really scientific football taking root in many places in the continent. And then today, I think the level of sophistication, preparation, and even standardized training is remarkable because of satellite television, because of the internet, WhatsApp, and of course, the fact that you have many, many great players from Africa playing in Europe and learning different styles, and then bringing them back to the continent. So the gap really is almost non-existent, in my opinion, now between Africa and the rest of the world in terms of styles of play. Great variety, great sophistication, great diversity, and I think that is partly responsible for the better level of play on the continent.
Yes, and also I know you're talking about people using technology, and we've seen how the digital age has changed everything, and you can see some people go on YouTube and they'll see what other coaches in other countries are doing, trying to bring it home and adapting to that. So what what do these changes tell us about exactly football in the society and its place in the society? Like, what do these changes that in the styles of play? Because I remember watching, they used to call it, and they still call it Sarri ball, though he was fired the other day by Juventus. But I remember there's a video that was posted online a few years ago on how his tactics come across, and it was viewed like it had more than 1 million views, and that's how you see how so many people are interested. And I remember there's even a team in Kenya which was trying to adapt the Sarri ball. So tell us about these changes and their place in the society.
Yeah, that's an excellent example of how, particularly communications technology, influences styles of play and modes of play, and also kind of how people think about the game intellectually. Because when you can actually visualize what, say, gegenpressing and Klopp's Liverpool is like, that's different from listening to somebody like me, for instance, give a lecture about it. As a Juventus fan, incidentally, you bring up a very painful subject, this Sarri ball, which I looked for an entire year, and it's not a coincidence I'm wearing the jersey of our new coach.
Your new coach. Amazing.
A very untested coach. I don't know if there's going to be a Pirlo ball, but I am one of the guys who'd like to see Pirlo on the
I'm
pitch.
thinking it will be more of defensive tactics. The ball playing from the back, but a very tight defense. We'll see. Yes.
Yeah, but I think it's a good example of how now, particularly on the African continent, there are so many great examples that local coaches can draw on to build a style that is consonant with the local preference and inclination, because this issue of African styles of play is a very thorny one, and one that continues to be debated. The two main debates, for example, that I hear a lot and participate in to some extent are sort of the romantic football versus the results-oriented football. And again, it's not only restricted to Africa, but it's quite important when you talk to older African specialists, for instance. They tend to see the game of the past in a romantic way, that there was more flair, there was more entertainment, there was more love than sort of, business-oriented approach to the game. And younger people, they haven't seen those games, so they kind of have to go with the memories of the old timers. But today it's all about results and how you achieve those results, perhaps more than the entertainment. The other thing is local coaches versus foreign coaches, and this is often racial. This is often viewed through the prism of race, of course, because there are still very few African national teams that are regularly coached by African managers. You can count them probably on the fingers of one hand. Aliou Cissé in Senegal is probably the most visible at this point. There are some others, but why is it that we have mediocre, untested white European managers often being put in charge of African national teams with a very limited pedigree? And moreover, you heard about the Tanzanian national team coach recently from Belgium, who was caught allegedly making, racist insults.
Comments.
Yeah,
Former younger coach. Yes.
Correct. How can this go on? And also importantly, how can these European coaches who don't know any African languages, who don't know the history of the places they're going into, they don't know the local football culture, how can they get the best out of their players, which is the manager's number one job, right? So I think it's a complicated issue, and I think for many African countries, the secret of success is developing locally. That doesn't mean shutting the global out. That would be foolish, of course, especially in the increasingly globalized world in which we live in. But it's putting local people in power and in charge, and allowing also local coaches to make mistakes. I mean, how are local coaches supposed to become the next, Guardiolas or Mourinho's or Klopp's or insert the name of your favorite manager, if they don't get the opportunity to test their ideas, to have the experiences which all the coaches that I mentioned had at lower levels, right? You can't just say, okay, on the eve of a World Cup, I'm going to, hire so-and-so from Germany, or I'm going to hire so-and-so from France to lead a team that they don't even know the players. They've never even been to the country.
Yes.
I think that's a major issue. And until you resolve these issues, how can you develop a kind of national style of play? It's very difficult.
Yes, and I hope the FAs are watching from across the continent. You talk about when you say about the local coaches and the foreign coaches, I think of the roots of colonialism, and also we have this aspect where, as you said, results. People want results, so results nowadays is equals to business. So people also want to make, if they're investors, they
Hmm.
want to make their money back, and they're looking
Sure.
forward to those profits. And then now some FAs start thinking, if we bring in the foreign coaches, we're going to get these results quickly. So you get to see the roots
Hmm.
of the previous past kind of still affect football in the modern day. But let's just move on to where football has also been used as a platform for identity formation when it comes to
Mm.
maintenance, self-organization, and civic-minded masculinity. Delve just further into that, just so that very many people can understand that in like in the layman's language, so that they can understand that.
Yeah, I mean, ever since the missionaries showed up in African regions with their Bibles and their footballs, and their collared shirts and so on, um,
Mm-hmm.
there's been this idea that sport can do more than act as a game, that it can teach moral values, that it can teach people to be better citizens. And
Mm-hmm.
I have to say that, initially I was quite skeptical of these initiatives for reasons that I'm not going to get into now. But as time went on, I realized that actually the missionaries were onto something quite important, and that is
Mm-hmm.
that there are a lot of bad influences in young people's lives, whether it's crime, whether it's alcohol or drugs or other things, and unfortunately, it's easy to get lost in that, and sometimes the adults are actually poor models for youngsters. So sports can have the potential to bring about, you know, a more disciplined, more healthy and dignified lifestyle, but it's very hard work to do so, because the experience I had in South Africa with a wonderful football academy called the Izitwe Football Club in Pietermaritzburg, in KwaZulu Natal, was one that really opened my eyes in new ways. And I had coached years earlier in a township outside of Cape Town called Kailicha, in
Mm-hmm.
very difficult circumstances. So I was familiar with the context, but what Izitwe showed was that, through hard work, through planning, through organization, through community participation, you could build not just a football club, but you could actually educate the citizens of the future in a holistic and extremely productive way. So how the club worked, I think, is a good model. And that is, first of all, you draw on talent in the schools. You go around the primary schools and lower secondary schools, and you have tryouts, and you collect some of the best talent, and you bring them to your pitch, and you don't train once or twice a week as if it's a recreational thing. You train every day. You train in a way that shows that there is a regiment that you must maintain if you want to achieve success. It's not a
Mm-hmm.
part-time job being a professional footballer, if you're lucky enough, if you're among the 0.01% in the world who are able to make a living from football. No, it's something you have to do full time. Okay, 5 days a week, at least 90 minutes a day. But you also must study, because so few young men and even fewer young women become
True.
professionals. You have to have a fallback. And so what Ezekiel did, and I think this is a wonderful model, is that
Mm-hmm.
it followed the kids in school. It offered tutoring and study hall after training. It spoke regularly with the teachers of all of the players. And if you fell below a certain standard of performance, you would be
Mm-hmm.
sanctioned. You see, and so that encouraged the students to become better learners while they were developing as footballers. And
Mm-hmm.
this was a 6-year program. It took them right through high school. And amazingly, what they did was, you know, they developed a lot of semi-professional players, a couple of top professional talents, and most importantly, they all finished high school, and many of these youngsters finished university. And now, if they don't make it as professional football players, they can be coaches, or they can go into business, or they can go into government, and they can have productive lives. And they did this with students who, youngsters who were very, of very limited means in most cases. So, money is important, but it's not the only thing. You need to have great local coaches and parents that are involved, and you'd have to do this full time. This is not something you can do part time as a kind of social responsibility initiative and photo opportunity, the way that too many football associations and corporations still do.
Yes, I love the point about education, and I always insist this. And I remember in I've also done a couple of interviews here and there, and I remember talking to the head coach of the Juventus Academy in Omar, and his name in Oman, rather, sorry, Oman,
Mm-hmm.
and his name is Gerard Lamy, and he told me there was a time he went and featured for the Arsenal Academy. He moved around, but he didn't make it. But because of that education, because of that investing in education, he didn't give up, and now he has ended up being the head coach of a top academy in the world. So that education part is important, and true to your word, Peter, that is what lacks in Africa, because when someone does not make it on the pitch, when someone does not make it to become a professional or a full-time football player, most of the footballers or young footballers in Africa kind of give up,
Mm-hmm.
or they'll fall back to crime. And that lack of education, and that lack of education aspect brings me to the administration part, to the governance part when it comes to African football, and definitely we
Mm-hmm.
have to talk about football administration in Africa. And media reports so many times have indicated that one of the issues facing the administration of football in Africa is let's talk about CAF, that is the head African football, the Africa's soccer's governing body, their factions, and it's not like a secret, it's actually known.
Sure.
Anglophone, Francophone countries, you can see how the leadership has gone around. And also, further, we have the North African speaking countries. It's just a war in itself. But because of these wars, that's when so much is not invested when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
the grassroots football. The players on the ground end up, suffering because of these wars here and there. So let's talk about that. What's your take on the football administration in Africa, and the way forward? Because this is the show about this. The thing about this show is that we are actually creating conversations that will shape the football industry in Africa and will improve the football on the continent. We are moving forward. This show will help us to move forward, Peter.
Well, I am afraid that I have very few positive things to say about football administrators, so maybe it's best I keep quiet. But I will qualify this by saying that I've seldom met football administrators anywhere in the world who are honest, transparent, accountable, or even competent, frankly. So in that respect, Africa is not special at all. I mean, you want
Yes.
to go and look at the FBI, Department of Justice, in ongoing investigation of FIFA, right, which has netted what 3 dozen or so arrests and indictments. How many of them are from Latin America and from the United States, right?
Yes.
Some of them have been sentenced, right? So again, Africa is not special in that way, but it is disconcerting because if you look at what CAF was doing in the early period, it was very productive. It was operating in a couple of ways. Number one, to make African nations full and equal members of the world of football. So they were fighting for an equal share of the pie, getting World Cup berths, etc. And indeed, they succeeded because Idnekachute Sema of Ethiopia, for instance, was a big reason why Joao Avelange was elected in 1974 as FIFA president, who became a big advocate of Africa, not, I think, because he was such a pro-Africa individual, but rather because he understood that if you got the votes of African nations, you were in a good position to win and win again as FIFA president. But Pan-Africanism also worked well within CAF at the time to overcome some of those divisions you talked about, North Africa versus Anglophone Africa versus Francophone Africa, and so on, because everyone hated apartheid. And so to keep South Africa, white South Africa, out of FIFA brought the vast majority of African countries together. And so
Yeah.
CAF in that period, I think, did a really nice job. It also helped the domestic leagues grow in the 1970s. There were some excellent leagues in Africa. They were so good that the Europeans started paying attention. And of course, by the 80s, things changed when more and more African players started leaving for Europe. But that's also when commercialism really took off. And I think when money became the only game in town, which starts happening in the 90s, but takes off in the 2000s. That's when the problem really gets very serious, because then being part of a football association is just a way to control the flow of cash. And as more and more players also are leaving African clubs and leagues, there's cash to be made there as well. And so, as money becomes the game, that's when, corruption and malfeasance and so on really take off. And again, I want to stress, this is not just an African thing, far from it. But it is a huge problem. So the example I mentioned before from South Africa of Izikwe, they wanted nothing to do with the local football association. They operated completely without their assistance because they knew that this would spell potential trouble. And so it was a totally grassroots, local, community-driven initiative. Now, on the one hand, that guaranteed its success at the local level. On the other hand, it made it very difficult to scale up, because if you don't have the support of your local and national football association, it's very, very, very tough to make it, a model that others can use effectively. So it's a bit of a bind, you see. You have to deal with the football associations in some ways, but how do you do that without compromising your values and without running into the problems that we all know too well exist?
Let's talk about some of the African players who've stood out. We have Mo Salah, and I will definitely talk about Liverpool, because that's where we are seeing most Africans now, because they won the Premier League. So we have Mo Salah, Sadio Mane, and we have also Naby Keita. And when you hear about their journey, definitely all the way from grassroots football, and that is the most amazing part, how you can move from grassroots football all the way to playing in professional top leagues across the country. But when it comes to talent, they're not the only ones who are talented. There might be the few ones who are spotted and the few ones who are actually got a chance to penetrate and get to that top level. There are so many millions and millions of African young players here on the continent who are waiting maybe for that chance. But because of this conversation, it's not about waiting. It's about developing that grassroots part so that everyone or most of them can actually get a chance and even start shining locally before they go internationally, or some of them just to play locally and still feel satisfied and also still, make a living, a good living out of it. So my question is, how do we guarantee the growth of grassroots football in Africa?
Another very important question. So, I think nobody is saying that preventing players from leaving and trying to make it at the highest level, in the Big Five in Europe or Champions League, or even, in a different type of professional setting is what we want to do. No, we want to encourage, the great talents like Mane, to make it, absolutely. But what about the 99.99% who are not at that level? Well, I think that's where the investment locally has to increase from a number of players. Number one, I think the relationship between schools and football clubs can be improved a great deal. I think the lack of, in many African countries, of a healthy sports sector is a drawback, because, it's hard to develop a grassroots movement when the only ones who advance are the ones who are lucky enough to be in an elite academy, or sort of a performance center. The other aspect is bringing in the private sector, for sure. And we have examples of this working. For example, if you look at TP Mazembe in Lubumbashi, where Moshe Katumbi has done a pretty remarkable job, has a privately owned stadium that Mazembe uses. It has such a strong financial base because of his own business interest and political clout, that he's able to attract players from other African countries, right? There's lots of foreign players who play for TP Mazembe. And it's a highly professionalized and yet locally based club. Patrice Motsepe with Mamelodi Sundowns in South Africa is another good example, with a fairly healthy youth sector as well, and there's some other examples. So it can be done. Sometimes it's a private sector driven process. Sometimes it's a more grassroots, but I think it entails everyone understanding that in making a new Drogba should not be the only goal for anyone involved in football. Yes, it's great if we get another Mane or another Yaya Touré or Michael Essien or what have you, Samuel Eto'o. Great, that would be fantastic. It will make people very proud. But we need to take care of the others, because if we do that, then the domestic leagues, for instance, and clubs, with the support of sponsors and FAs and others and broadcasters, will become much healthier. And then people can afford to live at home and have a living wage through football. So I think that is absolutely critical. And it's not a zero-sum game as I see it. It's not, either you stay at home or, you become a Sadio Mane. No.
Yes.
You can have both. You can have both. The other issue, of course, is what to do with the fact that more and more millions and millions of African fans couldn't care less about domestic football. It's English Premier League and Champions League. That's what it is. I mean, if there's a big game locally, David Goldblatt spoke about this very eloquently in your previous episode, right? Unless say you're in Dar es Salaam and Yanga and Simba are playing, or you're in Soweto and Chiefs and Pirates are playing, or what have you. Okay, aside from those examples, if there's a local game, the stadium will likely be empty, while next door in the pub or in the viewing area, it'll be crammed with people watching, Leeds United play Derby County. Let alone Arsenal versus Liverpool.
Yes.
And to me, again, I'm not putting down people who want to watch fantastic football. Of course, we all enjoy that. It's that all of this emotional energy and all of the financial investment seems to be going more and more into European elite football and not local soccer. And that's a big, big problem that needs to be addressed. There has to be a better balance, because otherwise, the African game is going to continue to struggle.
Yes, true. Oh my goodness. Time has moved so fast, but that is quite, thank you. Very insightful discussion. Let's now talk about you, Peter. So what projects are you currently working on? And anyone who wants to access your work, how can they access you, if it's on social media, and your work, the platforms that your work is on?
I'm working on several things. I'm particularly interested in doing a history of women's football in South Africa. The boom in women's football in Africa is one of the most exciting developments. We haven't had a chance to talk about this, but since the 1970s and increasingly since the 90s, and here CAF has done a reasonably good job with the support of FIFA. The women's game has grown, but we don't know much about its history. I have found bits and pieces here and there. In South Africa, there were women's games among white women in the 1920s. In Nigeria, there were several women's teams operating in the 1940s. But again, none of this history is really widely known. So I'm interested in doing this kind of work to show also that, African football doesn't have to be so overwhelmingly male, and can also make a great impact by giving greater opportunities to the loads and loads of female talents that I see all the time, and who really only run on their passion because they get so little support from the structures to become top players. And some still do, which is really remarkable. So that's one thing I'd like to do. And the other one is a biography of one of the earliest African players to play in Europe, and that is a Congolese player, Paul Bonga Bonga. And I've written a chapter with my good friend and colleague Gerard Aquindes from Benin, who you'll have on the show in the future. And we want to expand that to do a full-blown biography. This is a guy who was playing for Anderlecht in the early 1960s was selected as one of the top 11 players in Europe in 1962 by World Soccer Magazine, and nobody even knows who he is. And it's this lack of sense of history and appreciation of who came before the Drogbas and the Sadio Manes that I think is problematic, because it makes us look to Europe and to the North as, you know, the end all and be all, when some of the greatest examples of success and of strength and of empowerment come from within the African continent, which is where I think the future really lies. So those are a couple of the things that I'm working on. In terms of getting in touch, I mean, the best place is Twitter. You see it on the screen there. My handle is at footballprof, football written in the Spanish way, so that I don't confuse it with gridiron football, which in America is very popular, of course. And in Nigeria, too, I learned. It's the fastest growing spectator sport in Nigeria is American football. Because of the huge number of Nigerian Americans who play NCAA football and also NFL football. So that's the best place. And if you're lucky enough to be in a university, I mean, your library hopefully has access to my publications. And if not, just contact me through Twitter and I will get you copies of my work. It'll be a great pleasure.
Awesome. That was amazing. Thank you so much, Peter. So quickly, let's just take some of your comments. Ricky, thank you so much for tuning in. He says only 1/8 of the 1.5 million boys who play organized youth football in England will become a Premier League pro. That's a success rate of 0.012%. The source is from Michael Carvin, No Hunger in Paradise. So that figure in Africa with much less structure and pathway will be much, much lower, maybe 0.0012% at best. So that's 12 boys/girls out of every 1 million. Wow. The focus, therefore, has to be on the other 999,998 who do not make it to the structure, like Peter says, must offer something to this mass. Yes.
Excellent point. And we can all continue to play football when we grow old and we lose our hair, like me. You know, we don't all have to be, you know, we don't have to consider ourselves failures if we don't make it with the biggest club in town, or if we don't make it to Europe. For goodness sakes, there's so much more that we can do with the game. So yes, let's focus on the other 99.9%. Good point.
Yes. So another comment is from Benjamin Imbo, where he says educated Africans have a higher chance at success in their respective fields as compared to football. Our local leagues do not pay enough. Lack of proper facilities also mean we can't develop fully.
Yeah, that's a really important point about paying players. There was a report a couple of years ago that came out from FIFPro that showed that really so many, even top African clubs, don't pay their players reliably. And that is obviously a huge issue that needs to be addressed.
Yes.
And the proper facilities, I mean, anyone who's played football in Africa knows the reality. And that is also a big obstacle. I mean, Sadio Mane is really extraordinary in the way that, you know, he was able to transcend playing barefoot on a bumpy, dusty pitch to make it to Dakar, to the academy at Generation Foot, and then to France, and then onwards to Austria and to England. But he's again a rare case. So improvement of facilities is absolutely part of the issue, as is coaching development. You know, we need more professional coaches, even to work just with the youth, to get those fundamentals in between the age of 8 and 12, you know, boys and girls. Because once you have those fundamentals, you know, the sky is the limit. We don't need Mourinho wannabes pacing the sidelines with whistles and you know, notebooks, wanting these young boys and girls to be able to do tactical things that you cannot teach a young person to do. That comes later, but you need professional development. So alongside the better facilities, I think the coaching development is absolutely crucial. And it does take money. It takes financial commitment from government, from FAs, and from the private sector.
Yes. And finally, you must invest in coach education that is affordable and accessible. Number 2, you must invest in facilities, hundreds of small-sided or weather flood-lit facilities, again, which are accessible to the grassroots kids, yes, that cannot even afford a bus fare. That's a start. Everything else is semantics. That brings me to also, I remember what David talked about and what you have also talked about: education, the development of infrastructure according to Africa, not just putting up these huge, massive stadiums, which after 2010, after 2010 World Cup, that is in South Africa, some of them you don't know how you maintain them or what to do next with them. There's also that question. But building facilities that actually can accommodate Africans in their own way. So education, infrastructure, and also just shaping of the FA's administration, good governance. Peter, as we wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, it is really quite regrettable, and that these big stadiums that are built for mega events, not just the World Cup in South Africa, also the Africa Cup of Nations. I mean, how many of those stadiums are being used in Gabon, for instance, right? Let alone Equatorial Guinea and so on. But I mean, there has to be an investment in facilities that are used at the grassroots. I have to say, in South Africa, for all the money that was wasted on stadiums that were much too large and much too fancy, they did a nice job with the training grounds, and those are used regularly now by domestic clubs. They're much smaller, more intimate, and really have improved the quality of domestic football considerably. So, it's a bit of a mixed bag. But yeah, transport is another issue. And here, I want to raise my good friends at Izitwe again as a model. The only money they ever really got from a grant was invested in a 16-seater Toyota minibus. What in Kenya you call matatu, or a kombi in South Africa, a trotro in Accra. Yeah, because they realized, how can we get all these kids to the pitch every day if they have to spend money and time and also put themselves at risk by traveling on public transport every day? So that is a big, big issue. And if you want to develop the game, you need to consider these practical elements as well as the loftier ones. So be ambitious, but also, know that there's a lot of hard work and needed resources there. And rather than build fancy, headquarters and fancy, expensive stadiums, the money would be better spent where it can, in the long term, benefit the African football movement as a whole.
Yes, Peter. Thank you. I think we'll wrap up on that note. Oh, my goodness. Thank you so much for your wisdom. Thank you for sharing everything with us. And I know also I personally have learned so much of just about, Africa, the what we need to do, the steps that need to be taken. And I hope even when stakeholders sit down, they can think of Peter Alegi and bring him on board. And actually, because you are very familiar on what needs to be done when it comes to African football. So thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you so much for everyone who has been watching. Peter, last words as we wrap up?
No, it's been a genuine pleasure. I love this show that you're doing, and anything that I can do to assist in the future, be more than happy. I think the Africa-based scholars are going to be terrific because, David being from England and I'm from Italy and the United States, we have an outsider's perspective on things. And I think, African knowledge is absolutely critical. So, whether it's Igabo Chipande from Zambia, or whether it's Gerard Aquines from Benin, or, Solomon Waliaula from Kenya, Chiwashe from Zimbabwe, there are an incredible number of amazing scholars who are thinking about these issues in so many different ways, but from African perspectives. And that's where the solution really lies.
Thank you so much, Peter. I hope you all enjoyed the third episode of the Africa Football Business Show, brought to you by the Football Foundation for Africa. Don't forget to check them out on Twitter, on Facebook. Don't forget to also check out Brian Salah, who's behind the scenes and making this happen. And let's keep the conversation going. It doesn't end here. Make sure you also talk to Peter on Twitter. Talk to me on Twitter, Shon Osimbo. Let's keep this conversation about Africa going. Thank you so much, Peter. Have a lovely evening on your side. Take care. Bye. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.